Hey everyone, I'm Chris Lesniak,
And I'm Rob Byer, and this is
the Debate Math Podcast.
Debating Mathy topics and Mathy pedagogy with Mathy people just like you.
Let's get into this month's debate. Well, hello and welcome again to our Summer Hot Seat series.
And as a reminder, we thought we'd change things up a little bit during the summer months and offer something different.
Don't worry, our regular debates will be back in the fall, but again, for now, we wanted to put some educators with interesting ideas or strong opinions in a hot seat where they will share their thoughts and Rob and I will play the role of cross-examining them.
These are topics where someone has some strong ideas, but we may not be able to find and get some people together to have a full-fledged debate. So our host role is now a bit of a devil's advocate.
Quick note, regardless of our personal thoughts on the topic, Rob and I will be pushing back on the ideas presented. So our questions do not necessarily reflect our personal views.
For this hot seat, we wanted to talk about problem-based lessons. What are problem-based lessons and are they essential? Let's ask our guests.
Well, first up, we have a former high school math teacher turned math consultant, the founder of Tap Into Teen Minds, and co-founder of Make Math Moments and the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. It's Kyle Pearce. Hi, Kyle. Can you tell our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
Hi, everybody. How you doing? I am a K through 12 math consultant at Make Math Moments, and I spent over a decade as the K through 12 math consultant at Greater Essex County District School Board, and was a former math teacher. We're hanging out here in Bell River, Ontario, right now. That's just outside of Windsor, Ontario, across from Detroit, Michigan.
Arguing alongside him in this hot seat is high school math teacher, Desmos Fellow, designer of MrOrIsAGeek.com. That is MrOrIsAGeek.com. And co-founder of Making Math Moments and the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. It's John Orr. Hey, John.
Hey, everybody.
Can you tell our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
Sure. Like Kyle, I'm a K-12 math consultant here at Make Math Moment, and high school teacher for 19 years, like you said. And I'm right beside Kyle. So if you're listening to this, we're in the same room. We are here in Bell River and ready to argue with you two.
All right. And the question we ask all of our guests, and we'll start here with you, Kyle. When has math been controversial to you?
Oh boy, I feel like math is controversial quite a bit. I think one of the times that sort of pops into my head right now where it's been controversial is the idea of teaching math for the reason that it has to be useful in our daily lives. You know, I hear that a lot. I hear this argument that it needs to be relevant for kids and, you know, we need to give them math skills that they're going to use in life. And of course, we want some of that, but I think actually mathematics itself is more about teaching people how to think and how to be, you know, rational people, how to, you know, argue, how to conjecture, how to prove, how to be proven wrong, and then build from that. And I think, you know, it's just a controversial idea if we want to make math all about the things that you need each and every day of your adult life. There's a lot of really good thinking that can happen with some of the more abstract concepts that we do explore in our old school traditional K through 12 curriculum, as long as we do it well.
And John, when has math been controversial for you?
You know, I think when I think about this, I also my brain immediately went to a situation where it's about math being controversial, but almost like math professional development being in a way controversial. And it is a situation where it was like, I think it was my first year working at a district, and it was controversial in a way that, you know, math PD is sometimes passed down from, you know, the coordinator or, you know, district, you know, curriculum provider, or all of a sudden you're like in a math PD session. And I remember this being controversial because I was always going into like, hey, this PD session is going to be great, and maybe there's going to be a new idea, and I want to think about that. And why I think it's controversial is because now, you know, thinking about providing PD, we want to make sure that we're providing PD that is useful to people, but also like consistent to people, and like this consistent message. And why it was controversial to me back then, 19 years ago, was I was in that PD session. After the PD session, whatever tip, I can't even remember what the tip was or what the idea was presented, but I turned to this veteran teacher who'd been teaching probably then for 19 years. And he said, I was like, do you think we're like, I wasn't sure about the message there. Are we supposed to do that in the classroom? Is that like, what do we, are they coming to check up on us? Like, how much should we be doing that in my classroom, starting tomorrow? And he's like, hey, don't worry. You don't have to do any of it because they're going to turn, things are going to come and go. New initiatives are going to come next year. It's going to be something different the next time you sit in one of those sessions, and that thing is going to go out the window. And it's like this idea that for me back then, I was like, wait a minute. So do I take it or do I not take it? Like this person is saying, don't worry about it. And to me, I'm like, well, I thought I was supposed to think about this. Do I want to put that in my tool belt? Do I not want to put that in my tool belt? And where this like hits home for me now is like thinking about so many teachers are in these situations because we change focus all the time, because we're like, hey, we're talking about it one week, and if we switch focus and talk about it next week, that veteran teacher is the one saying, don't worry, they're going to change focus and something else will be important next week, and they will stop talking about that. And now it's like teachers don't know what to focus on a lot of times now because of this continually change of like where the real priority lies. And I think when we think about PD, we should make sure that we're trying to be focused, we're trying to be intentional, we're trying to be like consistent. These are the messages you want to provide. Otherwise, teachers just throw it out the window.
I couldn't agree with you more. And thank you both. With that, let's get into the debate. We begin with opening statements from these two lovely gentlemen. You have about 2 minutes to present your arguments, Kyle and John, and your time begins now.
All right. So problem-based lesson, in my opinion, are essential for one reason. Kyle's going to give you a different reason, but the one reason that I think problem-based lessons are essential is because they become assessment goldmine. When you introduce a problem and get students to engage in that problem, you give them that chance to productively struggle through a problem while you're observing, while you're listening to different strategies, while you're providing coaching along the side. You get to learn so much about what your students know or don't know, or where they are on the journey on that, the intentionality of that lesson. When I thought about teaching without problem-based lessons, you don't have those opportunities. You can't, if I taught the way I taught for 10 years, my first 10 years is like, I'm providing, let's say I go in and I go, here's what we're going to learn. Here's how you do it. Here's the example. You don't know anything about what the kids know or don't know on that topic. But when you start with a problem and you engage students in that problem, you can learn so much about what they know, and it can save you so much time by just understanding where students are in that trajectory. Kyle, you're up for a minute.
Awesome. So what I'm envisioning here, John, is that what we don't have to do is we don't have to necessarily do, say, a typical diagnostic ahead of a lesson. We don't have to bring in, 4 or 5 questions that are, boring and like start off the class on a bad note. We can actually build these types of questions into the beginning of a problem-based lesson with a really low floor, so that all students are walking in at a really low floor and they're all getting some quick wins. They're understanding the context. Even if it's an abstract concept, an abstract topic, we can still make it clear that every single student in the room understands what it is that we're actually focusing in on. And they're able to make estimates. They're able to enter into this problem. And then as the lesson's going, a well-designed problem-based lesson, that floor is going to be intentionally pushed up to a point where now we're going from a place where students have understanding, and we're pushing them past the place where maybe they've already been pre-taught. And we're trying to allow them to have the opportunity for a new epiphany. But I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there.
All right. Well, let's go into questions now. So let me back up for a second. How do you define problem-based lessons, or what's an example of something that you can give us in just like a quick elevator pitch?
Yeah, sure. I would say that a well-defined or a well-run problem-based lesson has a few different components. One is it starts with a curious provocation, starts with a curious prompt, something that generates curiosity. It isn't just us just saying, here's what we're going to learn today. Also, it is not just like, hey, here's a video. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Well, that may be true. That may be part of a problem-based lesson. It doesn't have to be a problem-based lesson. So it doesn't also have to be real world, in our opinion. So we don't have to have a real world. Now, while the context help in a lot of situations, it definitely does. And when we get to the next part, but it just has to engage curiosity, like what Kyle was saying. It gets us a foot in the door with that low floor. Now, what a problem-based lesson next does, it allows for estimation or prediction, and it allows for us to have like this element of anticipation. If we can have this element of anticipation, students are now kind of drawn into a problem and want to then solve that, whatever that problem happens to be. What they're going to generate some questions around what prompt is here. And that part allows that, get into the door. Kyle, what else might need to add into this?
Yeah, I think it's a key here is that withholding of information, right? So we're going to hold back intentionally some details because we don't want those, we'll call them the front runner students who are like, hey, as soon as they have enough information, they've calculated, they've used some algorithm that they learned at the after school math tutoring clinic. And then all of a sudden the entire opportunity for thinking is done. We want to slowly release that information. And then we truly want to hit them with an opportunity to what we call fuel sense making. So it's all about getting them thinking, getting them to actually try to struggle through an idea using the big ideas, the tools, the strategies, the models that they have in their back pocket to get to, or at least on the way to solving the problem, even if they don't get to the very end, in order to essentially tee us up or cue us up for the opportunity for us to engage in explicit instruction, to take and use that 5 practices sort of approach to bring it all together and try to draw out very intentionally based on what students did do. Or in some cases, if we didn't see something like that, we can share another strategy, my strategy, because my voice should be valued as the teacher too, not just the students, to make sure that they get exactly what it is that we intended to get out of that problem. Wasn't just a fun, curious, interesting activity with no real math residue associated with it.
So I'm wondering, to follow that up, as we're talking about these problem-based concepts, it makes me think, like, what's the difference between problem-based and project-based? I mean, they both have like that PBL. I'm just curious. I've been asked this. I've asked teachers this. What's the difference between problem-based and project-based?
Yeah, I would say project-based is going to actually be a little bit more open-ended. It's probably not going to be a single lesson. A project-based might be something that, is you're going into the community and you're looking for, say, a problem to solve. You're actually creating this thing, and you can learn a ton of great things by doing that. But one thing that I think you are essentially leaving to chance in that case, in a math situation, is you're leaving to chance that the problem the student or the project the student looking to actually solve actually helps to get to the standards that our grade level or our curriculum or our whatever it is, wherever you are in the world, whatever you want to call them, what it's asking us to ensure students get exposure to. So I could come up with maybe a project where that happened, but with a problem-based lesson, it's actually much more structured in that we are going to get to a place in this lesson, and the work we do up front is to ensure that all students can participate in that work, but ultimately at the end, we will be the teachers and the leaders to draw out the very intentional concept, the big idea, the strategy, the model that we want to make sure it is emerged in that particular lesson. Whereas I think a project-based approach, you could do a lot of great things and you can do a lot of great learning, but I feel like you are leaving the actual math standards a little bit open-ended and maybe more difficult to say, yes, we are going to cover the standards we need to by the end of, say, this project.
I'm wondering, I don't know how it is in Canada, but I know here, like, teachers feel there are so many standards they have to cover, state standards, common core standards, whatever they're following, right? There's so much needed to get through in a year, and we never get through it all, right? We never get to that last unit on data science or something like that. And so who has time for this? Like, this is going to take a whole day, a whole lesson out of our schedule. And you want to do this how often? Like, how do I find time for this?
I think it's a misconception in a way that it's going to take more time. And I think what Kyle said is that because we have when a well-run problem-based lesson is designed or carried out, it is really the we call it like the real flipped classroom, like the real, like, the old flipped classroom is like, oh, we're gonna like watch a video at home and then we're all gonna come in. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. So the real flipped classroom is we are we're thinking about this problem at the beginning, and then at the end we're doing that, what Kyle said, that explicit teaching, the bringing of it together. Let's talk about an example one, example two. Let's talk about what the learning goal was here today. Typically, why we're calling that the real flip class, because it was done at the beginning of our lesson in the old days. Like, we would do that, and then we would unpack and we do unfold all this, and then do like a problem at the end of that. We're doing that problem at the beginning and giving our students a chance to step in. Now, so that's all during that same time block that I would have done it in the old technique. So technically, I'm not adding any more time to my lesson when we're teaching it that way. That part of that misconception is that I think when people hear about problem-based lesson, they think, especially, it's like, if I want my kids to notice a wonder, that they think I have to go wherever the kids say they're going to go. And then that could lead into another full day. And now how do I teach, 2 days when normally what I wanted to cover my learning goal that one period? So that's not what we're talking about when we talk about problem-based lessons. We're talking about being very intentional. We're just opening up the door to allow that problem to unfold early, and then tie it up with like a bow on top at the end with a particular learning goal and what next steps are looking like for in that one class. Now, I'm going to add one more thing where it saves you actual time, because what I said at the beginning in my opening statement was, when you engage that student in that productive struggle and you are witnessing what strategies they're talking about, what strategies they're showing you, when you ask kids to go, what information do you need to help solve this particular problem? And they ask you, hey, I need the length here. And you say, well, if I gave you the length, what would you do with that? That key move right there, that student is going to tell you what's problem or what strategy they're thinking about, what math attached to that key piece of information that they're requesting. And that is that assessment goldmine that tells you where they are in this journey. When you start to realize that everyone, it's farther than maybe where you anticipated, you now go, I get to pivot where I am and go maybe I go a little bit quicker today, or maybe I need to backtrack, but that's going to save me time down the road because I don't have to backtrack hugely later, or it's going to allow my students to get to a deeper plate later on. When you learn so much about where your kids are on that topic, you can't help but save time.
You brought up again this an assessment goldmine, and so that just makes me think grading. Like,
yeah,
how do I grade this? And like, teachers say, like, I have to assign points to it, or they're not going to do it. Like, how do I do something with numbers and put it in the grade book? And what does that mean?
Yeah, I would say, like, when we're talking about like the assessment piece, a lot of times in this particular case, like, we're getting students, to actually engage, usually collaboratively, but not always, right? So sometimes they're working independently, but if we can, maybe utilizing, say, a building thinking classroom sort of approach to getting students, in random groups, getting them working on these problems. And ultimately what you're doing is you're actually having to develop a culture, which is going to take some time in order for students to recognize that when I go to math class, this teacher is asking me to think every day instead of sit and copy stuff, right? So basically it's a culture shift. And that means on the very first day of class, like, something we've advocated in some of our courses we've done around starting the school year off right, we don't do the syllabus on day one. On day one, we do a problem-based lesson with the group. Now, mind you, that floor is going to be extremely low. We're going to make sure it's extremely enjoyable, that students feel a satisfaction in it. So we're going to pick a task that may not necessarily be directly connected to, say, a standard in our grade level that year, but it's going to be a standard that matters. And it's going to be something that convinces and gives them sort of, we'll say, like a little bit of tire pumping that maybe they know more about math than they realized. Because a lot of times we've all been there. I'm sure you guys would, have this experience. You get one or more students on the first day of school come in like, hi, Mr. Pearce, nice to meet you. My name's, Tony, or my name's whoever. And don't call on me because I don't know any math, or something along those lines, right? Like, we've had that student coming in where they've already felt defeated. What we want to do is we want students to recognize that when you engage in a well-designed problem-based lesson, the estimation, what we call the estimation or prediction stage, often creates a bit of a sunk cost piece, right? The sunk cost fallacy. Like once you give something, once you spend $5 on a concert ticket, even though it's like should be more like a $30 concert ticket, you're more likely to show up to that concert, even if there's like a snowstorm. We're from Canada, so we get snowstorms. Some of you may not. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the same is true in a math class. Earlier, we can get kids talking with one another, getting them to discuss what they notice, what they wonder, or, what questions they might have, or where do they think we might be going with this, and then asking them to estimate or predict. It's like that jar of jelly beans. When you walk by a jar of jelly beans and there's pages there and everybody lines up to guess how many are in that jar, everybody wants to be a part of that. And then all of a sudden, they're actually interested to know how close they were. And this is something we can use in our classrooms to not only expose what students know in the math class, but it also creates this want to be a part of it, not because of marks. And that assessment John's talking about typically is observations and conversations. So we're walking around and we're observing what kids are doing. We're listening to strategies. We're really trying to put together, like, where are they on the continuum? Where are you in the trajectory of this concept that we're going to be exploring or that we're currently exploring? Like, oh my gosh, this is, we'll call proportional relationships. And this student is doing skip counting in order to get to the answer. That's really important to know, because that means they may not either understand what's happening here, but they do understand that there's a pattern, that they're skip counting, but maybe they aren't so great with their math facts yet. That's important information for me to know, because if I'm going to just throw out math fact type problems to kids, I need to then keep that in mind as I'm engaging them each and every day in my math class.
To address the grade book issue about students who are like, I'm only doing it for grade. In my classroom, the last, 5 years, I was telling them everything counts when you walk in the door. So if you think about what the purpose or the true purpose of assessment is, what Kai was saying, like you're trying to learn where the student is on the learning goal that you have. And the assessment's purpose is to give you information for you to act on that information to help the student go farther or reach the learning goal or reach the standard. That's the only purpose that assessment really is for. That some people would say that's formative assessment, but it's formative assessment until you put the grade on it and then lock that up in the grade book and never change it. Otherwise, it's always formative assessment. You should always use it as formative assessment. So when we walk in the door, when students walk in the door, I say, does this count for marks? And I say, from day one, everything you do in here influences how you understand the learning goals that we're looking at this particular day. So yes, everything that we are doing here counts. When we have a conversation, it counts. And when a teacher says, well, how does it count? We have to take that information. We have to trust our professional judgment. We don't we say that as teachers, but we don't trust our own professional judgment. English teachers, history teachers, they have they trust themselves more because it's like, oh, that's subjective. Math teachers are like, well, the numbers here prove that you got this grade, but you made the test, like you made it as easy or as hard as you want. But what I'm saying is, when you see and say a particular learning goal and what those look fors are to know when a student is meeting the standard, when they're meeting that standard well, when they're not meeting it well, just in a conversation a lot of the time. So when we're talking about, how well a student understands and can demonstrate and does that particular standard, you can use your own professional judgment to say that's where they are on that standard. So am I using the product that they produce on a quiz or a test? You got it. I definitely am. Am I using conversation that I'm having with the student because they're engaged in a problem-based lesson and I get to engage in that? Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to engage in it. That's why it's an essential piece. Yes, all those conversations count towards what grade I go to write on that particular standard. And yes, I'm tracking by standards. It's easier to do it that way. Mm-hmm. And so then hey, Chris, Rob, we could have a whole other debate on that, right? Right now alone, people are like,
you have a debate voice on right now.
I'm like aggressive. So
And I'm a
You're
little
ready to
worried.
win.
Hands are
take it
moving
over.
around.
Take it
If
over.
you're watching on YouTube or wherever it is on video, it's like I feel like I'm going to get hurt over here. He's winging me.
Yeah. So where are they? But I was saying that grade book, if you take that approach that everything counts, then and students know it, then you have to trust yourself. Because if a parent comes in, it's like, oh, I have to justify this to a parent. If you have to justify it to a parent, any parent, or parents are only concerned about like whether you have the best interest in mind. And so when you say like, I want to give your son, your daughter, your child, as much credit on that particular learning goal as I can, and I have to do when I see it. Right now, let's say they got this grade on this standard, I would gladly change that standard when consistent evidence has been presented to me that I'm like, yeah, they've now reached it. And so then we can say, I'll change it. But we have to be able to trust our own professional judgment in that way. And we have to be able to, and one way we do that is by engaging students in problem lessons.
All right, so I want to go back again because you keep talking about productive struggle, and you hear productive struggle all the time, it's almost like a buzzword nowadays. But I'm wondering within this structure of a problem-based lesson, sounds like there's a lot of collaboration. Sounds like there's a lot of student-to-student collaboration and dropping little nuggets and walking away and then letting the kids kind of have a productive struggle. My question is like, what happens if they aren't talking to each other? What happens if, with what has happened over the last 4 years, students have been struggling with that communication element of it. And, as a teacher, you facilitate, you're working with a group of kids and, they start to go, you're like, yeah, now I can go to the next group and kind of drop a little nugget for them. But then you look back and there's nothing, it's crickets. Mm-hmm. So if you have a class and you're trying to set up a problem-based lesson, how do we manage that? How do we get students to talk? Because if otherwise, it's like, why are we even doing it? Why don't we just go back to the old way?
Totally. I love that question. And here's the part that no one's going to really like is that you'll never know for certain why it's happening. But if I understand the elements, so if we kind of back, and now mind you, we were very quick as we sort of mention what a problem-based lesson is, but you think of all the different elements and really what we now have to do we'll call it from a different lens. We have to sort of almost assess our own lesson and how that lesson developed. And as we're doing this lesson, we're not just, scripting is really important as a starting point, but we always call it proceeding or pivoting at any point in this process, be it content or just being the actual lesson structure and delivery. We have to be assessing where students are at. If I see students have X's over their eyes, right? And it's like, no one's paying attention. Something there was missed. So did I miss them in the context? Like, did they even understand what this context is? Is that the problem? What can I ask students to get a better sense of that? So it really comes back to, again, questioning and really trying to figure out, did I push too quickly through this lesson? Like, did I assume too much about what I thought they understood about the context or about the question or about, what it is that I thought they had with them? So now what I have to do as an educator in that moment is I have to essentially on the spot, this is where planning ahead is so important so that you can think more flexibly in the moment. That's what's his face's quote there about, planning with precision so that you can proceed with flexibility.
Tom
Schimmer, great quote. And that's really what it's all about. It's like, I'm thinking this lesson through and I can't just ad-lib my way through the lesson because then when it does go wrong, I'm not going to know. So if I go back in that moment, as a teacher, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, you know what? I just want to go back to the old way. You know why the old way is easy? Because I never knew if kids got it anyway. I just got done, right? And then it's like you get to marking the quizzes and you're marking quizzes and then you're like, holy smokes, half the class failed. How did I not know that half the kids were going to fail this quiz? Well, because I was just telling kids what to do and they were copying it down and so forth. So this approach is certainly, it requires more practice, more skill development in your own facilitation, moves. And it requires a ton of planning and reflection. Now, we're not talking planning like it has to be the best lesson in the world, but it's like, I've got to think through when students get to this part of the lesson, what do I anticipate? That's that anticipation stage of the 5 practice. Like, what do I anticipate is going to happen? Is that curious enough? Is it too drawn out? Like, it's really hard. It's really much like an art. So when people start this process, what we used to do, we used to be, we would do a 3-act math task, style lesson. But what we recognized was we were just doing a fun little activity, and then we just taught like we did, afterwards. Or sometimes we pre-taught the lesson, taught the algorithm, and then we did a 3-act math task and just said, hey, like apply that to that. And that didn't really do what we needed it to do. So it requires much more precision when you're planning. And it also requires a lot of reflection throughout the lesson as well as after the lesson, because there are going to be some of those times. And you're like, are kids just off today? Were they all tired? Is it me? Is it the question? Is it not a productive struggle that I've created? Like, have I put them into an unproductive struggle? So there's a lot of moving parts there, but until you identify where you believe the actual bottleneck is in this lesson, it makes it difficult for you to decide, like, what is the thing that I'm going to do next? And the better I know the lesson and the outcome, the better my opportunity to adjust in the moment to give them a little more or push them a little bit further, or asking them, hey, what if you did blank as a start? Like, what's the next question that's going to keep them thinking, versus me just sort of like giving them the next step and then they, wait for me to come back around the room.
The other thing I'll toss in here too, you said it already, is that it is a culture you're trying to create. And so when you work to create this culture, yes, it's tough at the beginning. If you're just going to throw in that problem-based lesson, we got to take all the moves that you just said have to be very carefully thought out. But as you build it, it becomes easier and easier to engage in, getting their thoughts out, having, productive struggle, but discourse that is meaningful to students, and having, reasoning come out and shine through. And when you start like the year off like this, or when you decide maybe mid-year and you want to make that change, a great starting move is to have your student think about, what does good productive struggle look like, sound like? What does good reasoning and sharing and communicating look like, sound like? Get students to create a spectrum. What does it look like on this side? It's a good productive struggle. What does perseverance look like when working through problems? What are the look fors? What is it, what does it sound like? And over here on this side of the spectrum, what does it sound like and look like if we're not engaging in perseverance? We're not persevering today. And so when students create these descriptive words, and we do that like at the beginning, and they go, okay, this is where we are. This is where were you today? Get them to like go, hey, was I here today on the spectrum, or was I here today on the spectrum? And when we talk about what our culture looked like, every day we're going to be trying to talk about how do we use our productive struggle? How can we strengthen our perseverance on a daily basis? The next time you're engaging and you're noticing that this group at the wall isn't doing the productive struggle, they're not engaging in that discourse, draw the line, draw that spectrum, and then just go, hey, I'm gonna walk away, but before I do, I want you all to put where do you lie on the line? Where do you lie on the spectrum on perseverance? And then it's just going to trigger their look for on what's going on today, for them to be like, oh yeah, that's important to Mr. Orr. That's important, for us to be doing this today. It's just a trigger for us to go, oh yeah, these are things he looks for, or these are the things we should be engaging on a regular basis, because it's part of the culture that we've developed.
So last question quickly. What do we say to parents who are saying that you're not teaching clearly, or you're not teaching at all? Like, this isn't actual teaching. How I learned it. So What do we say to those parents? Quickly.
Well, first off, I would say you need to reflect on whether are they telling the truth, right? Do they know?
Yeah.
Because I'll argue that oftentimes when you make a shift towards trying to, we like to, in our minds, call this the real flipped classroom, as John mentioned. A lot of times what ends up happening is that we call that consolidation, the explicit teaching part. It's almost like teachers feel like they're not allowed to actually teach anymore, and that hopefully the kids got what they needed because they solved the problem. But in reality, a lot of times kids can solve a problem, but they didn't get the concept, right? Meaning, just because you solved this one problem in this one way with a really cool strategy do you understand what happened? And do you understand that that math behavior can be applied to any scenario like the one that we just dealt with? So how
Like
am I,
meaning,
it's meaningless. They walk out of that classroom, they go, that was a great activity. And then when you bring up another problem that's same, but different, right? You're like, it's a different problem, but same concept. They look at it and then they sort of start from scratch all over again. It's like, well, I thought we were going to now start actually becoming more efficient here. So we have to be intentional. We can't lose the intentionality of what we'd call a gradual release style lesson. Before it was like easy example, little harder example, really hard example, then like do it yourself type thing, right? And then kids would start, and it's like, that's not a bad idea to have. It's just, we just don't want to start that way, right? Like we still need kids to go, oh, so you're telling me that that scenario that we just did when we did this and then that, that we can actually do that in this other scenario over here? Yeah, let's try that one. How about this one over here? Great. What's our actual note going to look like? And whether you follow Peter's work and let the students, create their note to their forgetful self, or whether you want to be more structured and you're not ready to go there yet, and you're like, I'm going to still have a structured note at the end because I want to make sure, guess what? If the kids don't say this and this and this, I'm writing it down because I need them to know that that's why we just did what we did. It wasn't just to have fun. It wasn't just to estimate and have a celebration, but, with whoever got closest. It's that we had a really important thing that I wanted to reveal to you today. It becomes like, Dan Myers called it like a mathematical surprise, like you want it to be that way, but you don't want it to just be like, wow, that was a fun activity, but tomorrow we'll have this other random activity that has no connection. So I would say that's the big piece there is like, am I actually being clear in ensuring that students got what I wanted them to get at the beginning of the lesson and throughout it by the end?
because what's happening, right? Like if you're not clear, like they're going home and then they're telling, parents at home and going like, I don't know what happened today. And they're like, well, let me see your notes. And then they're like, well, I don't have any notes, and then if that's the case, then parents like, wait a minute, what's going on in here? And then they get concerned. It's because the student isn't feeling confident in the intentionality of that particular lesson and can't clearly articulate that at home. And then all of a sudden there's like questions coming up. But when that student feels supported, when that student feels like there was something here, and then it has to articulate it, they're better prepared to articulate that at home. And when they have that, like, hey, these are my reference points. These are the things that I can refer back to. These are, the big learning goal. But here for us to kind of reflect on, a parent can then go, okay, well, I can see what you've done, or you can articulate what you've done. And I also know that if I do call and talk to this particular teacher about this, the teacher, like what you said at the very beginning, is like, we have to reflect whether we are doing the right thing and we are feeling like we're giving kids that confidence that they're understanding what the lesson, because if the parent calls and all of a sudden I waver and I'm like, I tried this, and like, you don't have that confidence, it just unfolds even more. Like we have to have confidence and conviction in the learning goal of what we're looking at that particular lesson. And that comes down to that intentionality and making sure it's clear to kids.
And I want to add on, does that also, but just because we didn't talk about it, it doesn't mean a problem-based lesson doesn't have practice. Like kids need practice to get better at something. We can't just have them discover an idea and then move on.
Right.
Discover an idea and then move on. That will lead to either the concept not sticking, right? And not actually getting an opportunity to become confident with it, right? Just like if my son's at hockey practice right now and they show him one drill, they show him he does it 2 times, and then they expect that he's going to know how to use that in a game. That's not going to happen, right? So we have to be very intentional in that too. And that practice isn't a bad thing just because you want to try problem-based lesson. Practice is not a lesson. Practice is something that we do after the lesson is completed. We tie that bow, and then we think about, okay, what are the next intentional things that we want students to do? You don't have to do 100 problems, but I do have a handful of these problems that I've carefully selected for you to give a shot to. And I want to tomorrow unpack these with you to make sure that you got what it is that we tried to get you to walk away with today.
All right. Thank you both. That concludes our questions. And I just want to end by giving you a minute or so to kind of give your closing thoughts to our listeners. should we consider that problem-based lessons are essential? And the floor is yours.
We're here to say they are essential, and I think we made that very clear. We made that very clear that they're essential. And I think just to recap, I started this with the opening statement that they're essential because they're assessment gold mines. We talked about how to think about assessment. We talked about how to structure that lesson so that you can get it done in the time allotted so that it's not taking you extra time. We talked about how to make sure that you're being very intentional, so not only covering the learning goal, but you're also being able to address and give students what those next steps are and what that practice looks like. We're talking about flipping that classroom around so that you're getting kids to engage in productive struggle so that they can build their own confidence, and that you're creating a culture of questioning, a culture of discourse, a culture of reasoning within that community, and that community is going to strengthen over time. You can't do that in the lessons that you are typically just saying, I'm doing the we do model, and then here you go, do a bunch of homework questions. You don't get that culture in that way. You don't get the confidence that, students are building while they're engaging in that productive struggle. And you also don't get, say, where they're going to go on their current understanding of deeper concepts, because you didn't unpack it that way. You probably taught a very surface level of concept if you taught the I do, we do model like I did for 10 years.
I'm not really sure I can add much to that
it.
there,
You're
John.
done.
He left me nothing. But
I killed it.
what I will say too is that really a big takeaway I hope people are getting as well is that if you're thinking about problem-based lessons, it's not an either or with some of the other things that happen in an effective math program, right? So what we mean is we're talking specifically about new lesson content, new ideas, new concepts that we are trying to bring and emerge those big ideas, those strategies, those models. That is when a problem-based lesson makes sense. And it's not necessarily going to be every single day, because some other days might be purposeful practice. It may be, giving students opportunities to try a problem from a concept earlier in the year so that they have an opportunity to prove that they've developed their concepts since the last time we had explored this idea. So we're not talking about that being an entire program, but it is certainly a very important and I believe intricate portion of an effective math classroom.
All right. Thank you both. That concludes this debate. I hope this gives teachers out there some good food for thought.
And now it's up to our listeners to take a moment, ponder the hot seat discussion, and share with your friends, and consider what resonated with you. Be sure to go to our Twitter or X at @DebateMathPod to share your thoughts on this debate.
And again, huge thanks to both of you, Kyle and John, for joining us with your thoughtful discussion.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. Yeah, we loved every minute.
And thanks to those who are listening, and we hope you enjoyed and learned from this.
And as we wrap up, Kyle, where can listeners find you or find more about you?
You can find us on all social media platforms. Since this is the podcast, probably the best place to go is just search for Make Math Moments on any podcast platform and hit the follow button there. We release a weekly podcast as well as a bunch of problem-based lessons over on makemathmoment.com. And we appreciate you guys having us.
Another resource that you can find at makemathmoment.com is if you head on over to makemathmoment.com/report. We have a quick survey there for you as a classroom teacher to kind of, answer, questions about what your classroom looks like, sounds like, what some of the lesson style, the resources you're using. There are 6 key areas to strengthen in every math classroom. So if you fill out that assessment, we'll send you a custom report of which of the 6 areas you're doing well at, and which of the 6 areas you may want to kind of take a peek at and see if you can strengthen that area. So you can do that over at makemathmoments.com/report and take the next steps.
Awesome. We'll put all your stuff in the show notes.
Good, thank you.
All right. Thank you both. Want to learn more about incorporating debate activities into your math classroom? Go to luzniak.com/podcast to sign up for my mailing list and get your first set of example debate activities you could use with your students today. Go to luzniak.com/podcast.
Don't forget to reach out to us with comments and questions on debatemath.com or follow us on Twitter at DebateMathPod and follow along with hashtag DebateMathPod.
Rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts.
Or wherever you listen to this podcast. Your feedback is super important to us.
Well, that's all from us.
Looking forward to debating with you more next episode. Until next time, cheers.